Good evening, everyone. We continue our second part on 1 Samuel chapter 13. Now, yesterday we ended in verse 14. I just want to recap some of the things that we have been looking at in chapter 13. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is that as this is happening in the first year of Saul's reign. Now, the first year of Saul's reign is likely to be just after the first year. And Saul reigned for 2 years, and there would be another year or so of the history of Saul's reign in the coming chapters in 1 Samuel. But the important thing I wanted to highlight to you is that Saul and Jonathan went to trouble the Philistines and killed one garrison of troops. And that brought about the immense anger of the Philistines, and the numbers that they brought to bear in Michmash were 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and, well, troops. The way that they have described the numbers is like sand, right? Like sand on the seashore. Now, you have seen some of these words before if you have studied the book of Genesis, that God had made a promise to Abraham that his descendants will be like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the seashore. So this is a Hebrew type of expression that they are uncountable. Now, what is uncountable or innumerable? It means that physically, if you were to sit down and count and point to them, you would find it very, very hard to come up with a number. The number would be so large that you would not be able to count it. So that's what it means by uncountable. It doesn't mean that there is no finite number to it. And so there were a lot of them, and possibly more than 30,000 chariots. And so when you look at that whole scenario, that's an immense number of people from the Philistines coming to battle. Why am I alluding to this? Because once we move on from verse 15, you would find that there is a stark comparison. Saul earlier on had 2,000 with him, and Jonathan had 1,000. And so 3,000 troops versus the number that you see on the screen, that's nothing. I mean, you don't really have a battle. That's what the numbers are supposed to suggest to us. Now, by way of a review, I want to highlight to you verse 13 and 14 so that we connect on to verse 15 onwards. What is important is that Samuel had said to Saul that he had acted foolishly. He has made himself a fool, right? Made a fool of himself. And by fool, do not have the modern idea of fool. The idea here is one who lacks confidence in God. I think that would be a good way of expressing a fool. So don't think of it in 21st century. So that's what Saul did. He didn't want to make an offering, but he saw all these troops and he had no choice. And he fought against himself, but he did it anyways. And so the reason why I want to highlight you, verse 13, is this. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. Now, this is important. You have not guarded, observed, which he commanded you for now. And the punishment is that if he had kept, then we know from this text that the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Now, the word establish is caused to be firm, right? Caused to be firm. So you will have a stable kingdom, right? That would be what it means, secure. No, your kingdom will be secure. And it is only contingent on keeping the commandment of the Lord your God. Now that the punishment is there, observe verse 14. But now your kingdom shall not endure. And the word endure means it will not arise. It also tells us that there will be no successor to his kingdom. No successor. Now, what do you mean by no successor? It will be no successor from his descendants. And in the ancient times, the father would pass it to the son and so on. And God is saying it would not continue in that dynasty. Now, I would just want to point out to you this. God has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And this is the question that we have to be clear. A man after his own heart means this. Remember what is heart? Heart is mind. A man who is following, right? A man who is, how should we say, a man who has God's heart. I think that would be a way. So a man after his own heart, a man who is like, right? Who is like having his heart. Maybe this is a better way of explaining. A man like to his heart. What does it mean by this is that God is looking for a person who has a heart like God's heart. And by heart, it means mind. And what was God particular about his heart with regards to the king? Now, observe in the next sentence. Because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you, and God's mind is to keep what God has commanded. So a man after God's heart, or a man like to his heart, would be a man who would keep the commandments, right? The commandments of the Lord. That's all. God has a simple requirement, which tells us this later on when we talk about David being this person. And the fact that we use this phrase very often is that a man like to God's heart or God's mind would be, what does God want in his commandments, his instruction to the king, and that David would do. And we would see this accordingly in the book of Deuteronomy, and God has set guidelines for the king to make sure that the king knows what God's laws are and to implement them, not to seek after other gods and so on and so forth. And so a man after God's heart would be God's desire for that person in terms of his character. And that's what God wants, replacing Saul, who did not keep what the Lord has commanded. So understand that even in the English, you won't get wrong when you could see the flip side of the coin, that God rejected Saul because he did not keep the commandment of the Lord. So God would look for a man who would do that. And so a man who would do that to keep the Lord's command would be a man who is like to God's heart or God's mind. And God's mind is to have his commandment executed and upheld, being kept, being guarded, being passed on to the next generation. And that was exactly what David did. Moving on into verse 15 for today. After this episode of bad news to Saul, verse 15 says, Samuel arose and he went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. Now understand this, went up, which means this. In terms of a terrain, Gilgal is lower and Gibeah. And he went to meet up with Saul over there. So verse 15 tells us that from Gilgal, he went to Gibeah of Benjamin. Now, Gibeah, basically, Gibeah, right? Gibeah is really a hill. By that, we have a formal name. So you could say that this is the hill in the Benjamin territory. And then he went to see Saul. Now, what happened is Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now, what has happened is when the soldiers saw there were 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops that were uncountable, they went all over the place to hide. Now, those who are still there with Saul were originally 2,000, now only 600 men is with him. Now, these numbers are important because 600 is even smaller than 2,000. Verse 16, Saul and Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying at Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Now, roughly, I think I could just show you what some of these may mean. All right, may mean. And if this is let's say, this is the Jordan River, and we have our places. We have Gilgal, and then we would have as a hill, Gibeah, and then we have Gibeah, and then we have Michmash. Michmash is over here. Now, the interesting thing here is when Michmash is over there, these are all very hilly areas. I'm not sure how to show you, but these are all very hilly areas. And Gilgal is at the lower terrain. And that's why he says went up from Gilgal. Now, if you look at the next verse, in verse 17, we have here the Philistines. And we have here Saul and Jonathan. And so they're now kind of facing each other, right? Kind of facing each other. Now, going down to verse 17, and the raiders, these are the Philistines. They came from the camp of the Philistines and came out in three companies. Now, three companies means three heads. Now, what does that mean would be that they came out in three arrangements, right? One company turned towards here, Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Now, that would probably be right here. Let me just remove this. We would probably see it here. And this would be going up to Shual, Ophrah. So one band went there. In verse 18, another company turned towards Bet Horon. Now, Bet Horon would be this way up. This would be Bet Horon. And then another company turned toward the border, which overlooks the valley of Zeboim towards the wilderness. And the third one literally moved this way, down. Now, Zeboim is a very interesting word, and it's not something that we are comfortable with, but in actual fact, Zeboim is said to be some kind of a reptile. Now, those of you who are more interested in this, these would be some kind of a reptile. Some would say that they are dinosaurs, but whatever they are extinct, and we don't know exactly what they are, but it's a particular type of animal that is gathering and in the wilderness. Now, all we know now is this, that we have the Philistines going this side, and this side. Why? Because they are getting together, wanting to surround Saul and Jonathan. Now, right at this point in time, we have in verse 19, what we call a sidebar, I guess. It's gone away from the story, it's giving some background information with regards to this entire battle. So let's take a look at verse 19. Now, verse 19 says, no blacksmith could be found. Now, blacksmith, these are the skillful people, the skilled people. Now, the tradition has it that when the Philistines took the land or put Israel into subjugation, they retired all the blacksmiths for one purpose. So the blacksmith could not be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews would make swords or spears, and these are artillery or equipment for warfare. And so all of these were retired so that there is no threat to the Philistines. That's one piece of information that we have. Verse 20. And so all Israel went down to the Philistines. If you want to sharpen, the word sharpen here is to, well, I guess sharpen is the good word. Let's leave it there. His plowshare. Now, there's a number of words here. His plowshare here, the first of the plowshares. This actually means something that is see. There are three plow. This is the first plowshare. So what does it mean? Let's see. This one is the plowshare is for plowing, right? This is for plowing, for agriculture. The sharp tip of the plow. The second one is the mattock. The mattock here actually means a kind of how should you say, something for digging, something for digging, maybe a hole. The third one here is the axe, right? This is a good word. And the last one here, it says the hole in the New American. This would be a pickaxe. Pickaxe. Now, what does that mean? So if you have this as an axe, this means it will look something like this. A pickaxe would look something like this. They are sharp. A mattock would be something for digging, so you have a hole. And a plowshare is something sharp for the plow. So these are all sharp, I guess, utensils or implements. Now, what is important is in verse 21, it means that by this time, they have nobody to sharpen anything that you can prepare swords or spears. So what were the army of Israel holding? Sticks, probably. But in verse 21 gives us a glimpse of what actually happened. Because they had to rely on the Philistines, the Israelites were more innovative people. And so this word, the charge, is for us to understand. Well, I guess verse 21 is a bit difficult to translate, and the English is all over the place. So let me see how to rectify this. Verse 21 should read this. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattock, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. Let's say that the entire statement is incorrect. For this one here, we can keep the charge was 2/3 for a shekel. I think we can strike out. This is not about going to the Philistines and paying them 2/3 of a shekel to sharpen their plowshare, mattock, the hoe, the axe, or the pickaxe. The word here is they actually made a sharpening mouth. So what does it mean? They made so there was the sharpening stone. For the plowshares, right? This one is the pickaxe. The second one would be the hoe. The third one here would be the three trident, or what do you call it? Three-pronged, right? The fox. This is a three-pronged fox. What do you mean? It means this. That is what it means, like a trident, right? The last one here is the axe, and this is correct. Now, the last point here is a problem, right? This one here. It doesn't mean to fix the holes. It means to cause let's say to cause to stand. And then to cause to stand, the final word is a bit uncertain, but I think we can say that to set the goat, to cause to stand the goat. Now, let me explain what this means. The word to cause to stand the goat is to fix it, the sharpening stone, which I think might look something like this, right? The sharpening stone was to cause to stand the goat to make sure that all the utensils, like the axe, is sharpened for goading use, right? For goad, goad means to poke or to strike. Usually, as a word, to poke, I think is a good word, because when you are having two ox plowing, when one of the ox goes out of the line, you goad the ox. The idea of goading is to bring it back, to teach it, to discipline. And this whole idea was the sharpening stone is the description here, to sharpen their own pickaxes, the hoes, the prong forks, and the axes, so that they can use it properly. Otherwise, the whole land of Israel would not be able to function at all. And so it is not then that they are now dependent on the Philistines. They actually found a way to help themselves. And so they were able to continue in their agriculture life. They were not using this for swords or spears in that sense. Right? That would be the picture that we have here in verse 21. Now, in verse 22, it says that it came about on the day of battle, when they are supposed to clash. There was no sword nor spear found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and Jonathan. What does that mean? It means that sword and spear was only with Saul and Jonathan, and the entire troops. What do they have? They have agricultural implements. They have the axe that they use to cut wood. They have the pickaxe to pick at stones that they needed to chisel. They had plowshares, right? They had pitchforks. So what do they have? They don't have battle utensils or battle implements. They have agricultural implements, except for Saul and Jonathan. That is what verse 22 is saying. And this is a very scary event, I would say, for the Israelites. Looking at the Philistines completely geared up with chariots, with horses. And here there are 600 of them now, Saul and Jonathan. And what do they have? They have pitchforks. They have axes. They have plowshares. They have hoes. And what good is that? Are they going for agriculture or are they going for battle? And they are going for battle because the day of battle was at hand. Verse 23, and the garrison of the Philistines, they went out to the pass of Michmash. Now, the pass of Michmash is quite interesting because we don't see this. The pass means it's between two hills, right? These are all rocky. And so it essentially is telling us that the Philistines came out through the gap of the hills. So this is what the past means of Michmash, just next to Michmash, and they were coming out to take position against Saul and Jonathan with all their swords and spears and knives and all the battle equipment, including bows and arrows. And the armies of Saul and Jonathan had nothing except for whatever Saul and Jonathan had. Now, this is the picture that we are left with in chapter 13. And the moment we get into chapter 14, it describes how that battle took place. Now, at this point in time, when we have finished reading chapter 13, we are faced with an impossible situation. And you can imagine why Saul was so anxious, filled with anxiety, could not wait for Samuel to arrive. He had to just, well, for lack of a better word, fear for his life and try to appease God and find out what else he needs to do. And he did it wrong. He did not keep the commandment of the Lord. And thereby, in one sweep of the moment, God decided to end his kingdom, that it would not endure, and that he would be the last of the people of Saul in Benjamin, of his lineage, to become king. God had no patience with Saul at all. And I suppose it is because also the people were asking a human king, and God had allowed him to become king. And the moment that Saul made his grievous error, the first of two major judgments took place. In verse 13 and 14, the kingdom of Saul will eventually come to an end. If he had been obedient, he would have perpetuated his dynasty from generation to generation, but it didn't. So the fact of the matter is, there was this picture that God had painted to us, that he had no patience with Saul because he was not a man who had a heart like God. And so God says he will have to look for one who would have God's heart as his heart. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 13.